I'd been renting out properties for about 5 years, and while I've dealt with my fair share of weird tenants, hoarders, late payers, even someone who tried to keep a goat in their living room, nothing, and I mean nothing, comes close to what I found in that basement. It was a duplex I'd been renting to this guy named Alan for almost 3 years. Quiet, always paid on time, never caused any trouble. Honestly, I'd kind of forgotten about him until he called a few months ago to say he was moving out. No notice, no explanation, just said he was leaving the keys under the mat. When I showed up, the place was empty, completely bare. He even vacuumed, which I thought was a nice touch at first. But as I walked through the house, something felt off. I don't know how to explain it. The air was heavy, like the kind of weight you feel in a storm right before the thunder hits. The upstairs was fine, just a little dusty. But when I went into the basement, that's when things started to get strange. The first thing I noticed was the smell, kind of metallic, but with this sour edge, like old blood and damp concrete. I figured maybe there'd been a leak or some kind of rodent problem. The second thing was the walls. Alan had carved these weird symbols into the concrete. Circles, triangles, overlapping shapes I didn't recognize. Some of them looked like writing, but in a language I couldn't read. At first, I thought maybe it was just graffiti he'd covered up with paint. But no, the grooves were fresh. Then I saw the floor. There was this patch in the corner where the concrete didn't quite match the rest. It was smoother, newer, like it had been poured recently. And right in the middle of it was a faint crack, almost like someone had tried to seal something up but didn't finish the job. I don't know what possessed me to start poking around. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the way the air seemed to buzz in that spot, like a faint vibration under my feet. I found a crowbar in the garage and went back down. It took a few good swings, but eventually the slab gave way. Beneath it wasn't dirt or foundation. There was a hidden compartment, maybe 4 feet wide. And in the middle of that compartment was a hole. A pit, really. About 6 feet across and God knows how deep. I couldn't see the bottom, even with my flashlight. The walls were lined with metal chains, like the kind you'd use to tow a car. Some of them were broken, but others still hung there, bolted into the sides. And there were stains, dark crusted stains that trailed down into the darkness. I should have called the cops right then and there. I should have backed out of that basement and never looked back. But I didn't. I leaned in closer, shining the light around the edges of the pit. That's when I saw it. A handprint. Small, like a child's, pressed into the grime near the rim. My stomach dropped. The air in the basement felt colder, and for a second I thought I heard something. A faint noise coming from the pit. It was so quiet I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then it came again. A soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, listening to whatever was in that hole. My mind was racing. What if Alan had been keeping someone down there? What if they were still alive? I forced myself to step back and grab my phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. When the cops arrived, I thought they'd take one look at the pit and call in a whole team. But they barely seemed fazed. One of them, a guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shined his flashlight into the hole, muttered something about it being a weird setup, and then told me it was probably just an old storm shelter or cistern. But what about the chains, the symbols, the handprint? I pressed. He shrugged. Graffiti artists, maybe? Kids playing around. I could tell he didn't believe me. They didn't even bother to check for fingerprints. The next day, I went back to seal the hole. I didn't want anyone else finding it. God knows what kind of people might be drawn to something like that. As I worked, I kept thinking about Alan. He hadn't left a forwarding address and his phone was disconnected. It was like he'd just vanished. I still have nightmares about that basement, about the symbols, the pit, and that faint, rhythmic sound coming from the darkness. Sometimes I wake up hearing it, like it followed me home. I sold the house a few weeks later. Didn't even bother mentioning the basement to the new owners. If they find it, well, that's their problem now. That's there. I've been renting out properties for years, and I thought I'd seen it all. Trash-filled apartments, unauthorized pets, weird smells. But nothing could have prepared me for the day I unlocked that door. The tenant, Kyle, had moved in about a year ago. Quiet guy, kept to himself, always paid rent on time. I barely ever saw him, which honestly was fine by me. He'd send his checks, and that was that. But about 6 months ago, the checks stopped coming. At first, I thought maybe he was going through a rough patch, so I gave him some leeway. I left a couple of voicemails, sent an email or two, even slipped a note under his door. No response. By the 3rd month, I was out of patience. I'd sent enough warnings, and the rent was adding up. I decided it was time to take a look inside, maybe figure out what was going on. Honestly, I expected to find an empty apartment. People skip out on leases all the time. What I found was different. The place was eerily quiet when I walked in, but not the kind of quiet that feels normal. It was heavy, oppressive, like the silence had weight to it. The living room was clean, almost too clean. No dishes in the sink, no laundry lying around, no signs of life at all. It didn't look like anyone had been there for months. Then I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but the closer I got to the bedroom door, the stronger it became. That sickly sweet rotting smell you never forget once you've smelled it. I tried knocking, more out of habit than anything else. Of course, there was no answer. The door was locked, and I had this sinking feeling in my gut. Something was wrong. I called a locksmith who arrived within the hour. He gave me a weird look when he smelled the air, but he didn't ask any questions. With a few twists of his tools, the door swung open, and there he was. Kyle was slumped in the corner of the room, half covered by a thin, stained blanket. His skin was gray, his body bloated and twisted, his eyes sunken into his skull. It was clear he'd been there for a long time. The smell hit me like a punch in the face, and I stumbled back, gagging. I couldn't believe it. He'd been dead for months, and no one, not his family, not his friends, not his neighbors, had said a word. The police came quickly, sealed off the place, and took Kyle's body away. They told me it looked like a suicide. Pills, they said. There was an empty bottle on the floor next to him. The officer in charge was calm, almost clinical about it, but I could see the unease in his eyes. Something wasn't sitting right with him either. After the cops left, I had to go back in to start cleaning up, or at least to figure out what I was dealing with. That's when I found the journal. It was sitting on the nightstand, black leather, with Kyle's name etched on the cover. I hesitated before opening it, feeling like I was intruding on something private, but curiosity got the better of me. The entries started off normal enough. Mundane stuff about work, the weather, how he was struggling to make friends in the city. But as I flipped through, the tone changed. His handwriting grew messier, the entries shorter, more frantic. He wrote about hearing noises at night, whispers, footsteps, the sound of something brushing against the walls. At first, he thought it was the neighbors, but then he started to believe it was coming from inside his apartment. The later entries were disturbing. He described waking up to find things moved around his room. Drawers open, clothes strewn on the floor. He swore he saw shadows that didn't belong to him. He wrote about locking his bedroom door every night only to wake up and find it unlocked. The last few entries made my skin crawl. One of them said, "I'm not alone in here. I can feel it watching me when I sleep." Another read, "It doesn't want me to leave. I think it's been here all along." The very last entry, written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting, said, "I hear it breathing. It's in the room with me." I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. There was no sign of anyone else in that apartment. No footprints, no extra belongings, nothing. And yet the way Kyle described it, it didn't feel like a delusion. It felt real. The apartment sat empty for months after that. No matter how much I cleaned, I couldn't get rid of that smell, that feeling. Eventually, I sold the place dirt cheap to some property investor who didn't ask too many questions. I didn't tell him about Kyle, or the journal, or the way I sometimes felt like someone was watching me every time I stepped inside. I still think about that room sometimes, about the chains on the inside of the closet door, like someone had tried to lock themselves in, or lock something out. About the scratches on the floorboards near the corner where Kyle died, like someone, or something, had been clawing at the wood. Most of all, I think about those last words in his journal. It's in the room with me, and I wonder, what if it still is? You never really know your tenants. That's something I've learned after years of renting out properties. People seem normal enough during a walkthrough, but once they settle in, you start hearing stories from neighbors or finding clues they leave behind. This one, though, this one still keeps me up at night. It started with a text from one of my renters. The guy, Ezra, had been living in one of my units for about 2 years. Quiet, always paid his rent on time, never caused any trouble. Honestly, the kind of tenant every landlord hopes for. But out of nowhere, he sent me a message saying he was moving out immediately. No explanation, just, "I won't be staying here anymore. You can keep my deposit." That was it. No call, no follow-up, he was just gone. When I showed up to inspect the place, it was immaculate. Almost too clean. Most tenants leave behind at least a few scuffs or marks, maybe some junk they didn't want to take with them. Not Ezra. The house looked like he'd barely lived there. The only thing that stood out was the backyard. When Ezra moved in, there was nothing out back but overgrown weeds and a broken fence. But now, the place was like something out of a botanical garden. Rows of vibrant flowers, perfectly trimmed hedges, even a small stone pathway leading to a cluster of trees in the far corner. It didn't seem like Ezra's style at all, but I figured maybe he'd gotten into gardening to pass the time. Still, something about it felt off. For one thing, the garden smelled wrong. Not the fresh, earthy scent you'd expect, but something sour, almost metallic. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to fertilizer or rotting mulch, but the longer I stayed out there, the harder it was to ignore. Then there was the way the garden was arranged. At first glance, it looked random, just a mix of flowers and plants. But as I walked the paths, I noticed a pattern, a spiral. All the plants curved inward, leading to a small clearing near the center. And in that clearing was a mound of freshly turned soil. I don't know what possessed me to start digging. Maybe it was the smell, or maybe it was just curiosity. Either way, I grabbed a shovel from the shed and went to work. The soil was loose, almost too easy to dig through, and about a foot down, I hit something solid. Bones. At first, I thought they were animal bones. Small, brittle, nothing too unusual. People bury pets in their yards all the time, right? But as I dug deeper, I uncovered more. A lot more. Some were bigger, and the shapes weren't right. Too long, too curved. That sinking feeling in my gut started to grow. And then I found the skull. It wasn't an animal. There was no mistaking it. Human. Adult. My hand started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the shovel. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I should have stopped there, should have called the police immediately. But something about the way the garden was laid out, it felt intentional. Like Ezra wanted someone to find this. So I kept digging. By the time I stopped, I'd uncovered 2 more skeletons. One was small. Too small. A child, maybe. The bones were tangled together, almost like they'd been dumped in a hurry. And mixed in with the remains were things. A rusted locket, a cracked pair of glasses, a small, dirty teddy bear. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the cops, my voice shaking so badly I could barely get the words out. When they arrived, they cordoned off the area and started asking me questions. How long had Ezra been living here? Did he seem strange? Had I noticed anything unusual? I answered as best I could, but the truth was, Ezra had been a ghost. No friends, no visitors, no hints at who he really was. The investigation went on for weeks. The remains were sent off for analysis, and the police dug up the entire garden. They found more bones, more objects, enough to suggest that this wasn't a one-time thing. Ezra hadn't just planted a garden, he'd created a graveyard. The most chilling part? They couldn't tie any of the remains to missing persons cases in the area. No one knew who these people were, or how they'd ended up buried in Ezra's backyard. It was like they'd been erased. The police eventually tracked Ezra down in another state, but by then he'd disappeared again, leaving behind nothing but an empty apartment. Last I heard, the case was still open, with no leads on where he might be. I sold the house not long after. I couldn't even look at the place without feeling sick. But sometimes late at night I catch myself thinking about that garden, about the way the flowers grew so perfectly, so unnaturally vibrant. And I wonder, was it just the soil? Or was there something else, something darker, feeding those roots? And wherever Ezra is now, is he planting another garden? I've been a landlord for over a decade, and I thought I'd seen it all. Late rent, trashed walls, abandoned junk, weird smells. You name it. But nothing prepared me for the day I walked into one of my rentals and found no doors. It started with a seemingly normal family, a couple with 2 kids and a dog. They passed the background check, had decent credit, and even paid a few months up front. The dad worked in construction, and the mom ran some kind of online business. They seemed polite, down to earth, and grateful for the place. Honestly, I thought I lucked out. For the first year, everything was smooth. Rent always came on time, and I didn't hear a peep from them. No complaints, no maintenance requests, nothing. It was almost too quiet. Then out of nowhere, they gave their notice to move out. No reason, just said they were relocating for work. I scheduled a walkthrough for the last day of their lease, expecting the usual minor wear and tear. What I got instead, and was the most bizarre scene I've ever encountered. The house looked fine, clean even. The carpets were vacuumed, the kitchen was spotless, and there wasn't a single scuff on the walls. But as I walked through the living room, something felt off. It took me a second to realize what it was. The front door was missing. I froze, staring at the empty frame. The hinges were still there, but the door itself was gone. I thought, okay, maybe they took it off to move furniture and forgot to put it back. Weird, but not the end of the world. Then I walked into the hallway, and there it hit me. None of the doors were there. Not the bedroom doors, not the bathroom door, not even the pantry. Just gaping frames with the hinges dangling awkwardly, like the doors had been ripped out in a hurry. I felt my stomach drop. My first thought was, who steals doors? My second thought was, what else did they take? I rushed to the kitchen, the laundry room, the garage. Appliances? Still there. Fixtures? Intact. Even the light bulbs were in place. It was just the doors. Every single door. By the time I made it upstairs, I was half laughing, half panicking. The master bedroom was missing its door too, of course. But the closet inside? The sliding doors were gone. The ensuite bathroom? Gone. The attic access panel? Gone. They hadn't just stolen the main doors, they'd taken every removable panel in the entire house. I grabbed my phone to call the tenants, but of course they didn't answer. I left a polite but frantic voicemail, something like, "Hey, it's your landlord. Just wondering if you accidentally took the doors with you when you moved out? Please call me back." I immediately followed up with a text. Nothing. Radio silence. At that point, I decided to look around more carefully, hoping for clues. That's when I noticed the scratches on the door frames, deep grooves like someone had pried the doors off with a crowbar. And scattered in the corners of each room were random hardware pieces, screws, broken hinges, even a couple of splintered wood chips. The creepiest part? In the kids' bedroom, one of the walls had faint pencil marks, stick figures, a crude drawing of what looked like a door, and next to it scrawled in shaky handwriting, "No one can find us now." I noped out of there so fast I didn't even lock the front door, or the frame, I guess. I went straight to my car and called the police. The officer who showed up was just as baffled as I was. He asked the same questions I'd been asking myself. Why steal the doors? What could they possibly do with them? Resell them? Build a fort? It made no sense. Still, he filed a report and said they'd look into it. Weeks went by and I heard nothing. I tried calling the tenants again, but their number was disconnected. The forwarding address they'd provided on their lease was fake, and no one in the neighborhood remembered seeing a moving truck. It was like they'd vanished. Eventually, I had to suck it up and replace all the doors out of pocket. Thousands of dollars gone. And every time I installed a new one, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Like the house didn't want the doors back. To this day, I still wonder about that family. Were they just crazy? Did they have some bizarre obsession with doors? Or was it something darker? Something tied to that eerie message in the kids' room. No one can find us now. I'll never know for sure, but one thing's certain. Whenever I rent out a property now, I take inventory of everything. I've dealt with a lot as a landlord. Late payments, trashed properties, even the occasional tenant who just disappears in the middle of the night. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened with apartment 3C. It wasn't just bizarre, it was horrifying. The tenant, Alan, moved in a little over a year ago. Seemed like a decent guy. Quiet, mid-30s, worked from home, paid rent on time. Honestly, I didn't think twice about him. He kept to himself, no loud parties, no complaints from the neighbors. If anything, he was the kind of tenant every landlord hopes for. But about 6 months into his lease, Alan started sending emails. At first, they were minor complaints. Stuff like the water pressure in the shower being weak or the fridge making a strange noise. Nothing out of the ordinary, so I handled it quickly and thought that was that. Then the tone of his emails changed. He started complaining about feeling sick all the time, headaches, nausea, difficulty breathing. He was convinced the apartment was to blame. Specifically, he said it was mold. He'd attached photos of what looked like small dark spots near the air vents, claiming the entire system was contaminated. I had the place inspected immediately, and the technician assured me there was no mold, just some harmless dust buildup. I passed that information along to Alan, thinking it would put his mind at ease. But it didn't. If anything, it made things worse. The emails became more frequent, more frantic. Alan was convinced the apartment was poisoning him. He started missing rent payments, saying he couldn't work because he was so sick. When I called to discuss the situation, he accused me of neglect and threatened to sue. I tried to reason with him, even offered to let him break the lease and move out, but he refused. He said he wouldn't leave until I fixed the toxic air vents. Then, about 3 months ago, Alan stopped responding entirely. No emails, no calls, no payments. I assumed he'd finally decided to move out, so I started the eviction process. A week before the court date, I got a call from one of the neighbors. She said she hadn't seen Alan in weeks and was worried something might have happened to him. My stomach sank. I went to the apartment immediately, knocked on the door, and when there was no answer, I used my spare key to let myself in. The smell hit me first, pungent, chemical, almost metallic. It made my eyes water and my throat burn. I called out for Alan, but there was no response. The place was a mess. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, garbage overflowing, windows sealed shut with duct tape. And then, in the bedroom, I found him. Alan was slumped in a chair, motionless, pale. A mask covered his face, one of those industrial respirators you see on construction sites. At first I thought he was asleep, but as I got closer, it became clear he wasn't breathing. I called 911, but it was too late. Alan was dead. The coroner ruled it as respiratory failure due to prolonged exposure to hazardous chemicals. At the time, they assumed it was accidental. Maybe he'd been using cleaning products in an enclosed space and hadn't ventilated properly. But something about it didn't sit right with me. After the police cleared the apartment, I went back to clean it out. That's when I noticed the vents. They were coated in a strange, sticky residue, yellowish and foul-smelling. It didn't look like mold. I called the same technician who had inspected the vents months earlier, and when he opened the system, he found several plastic containers hidden inside, each filled with a viscous, toxic substance. The air circulation had been spreading the fumes throughout the apartment for weeks, maybe months. I was horrified. Who would do something like this? And then it hit me. Alan. The containers weren't there during the initial inspection, which meant someone had placed them afterward. The technician even found fingerprints on the lids. I went through Alan's emails again, looking for clues, and one phrase stood out: "I'm going to make sure you pay for this." At the time, I'd thought he was talking about suing me. But now, it seemed like he had a much darker plan. He must have been trying to create evidence of a toxic apartment, evidence he could use in a lawsuit. But in his desperation, he'd poisoned himself instead. The police reopened the case after I turned over the evidence. They confirmed that Alan had purchased the chemicals online and that the containers matched his fingerprints. It was ruled a case of accidental self-harm, and I was cleared of any responsibility. But the whole thing left me shaken. I replaced the entire ventilation system, scrubbed the apartment from top to bottom, and even hired a priest to bless the place. Not because I'm particularly religious, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark still lingered there. To this day, I can't walk past apartment 3C without feeling a chill. Alan's death was tragic, but the worst part is knowing it didn't have to happen. Whatever demons he was fighting, they consumed him and left their mark on that apartment forever.